Every place has their urban legends. Illinois has Homie the Clown, West Virginia has the Mothman, New York has Cropsy, Texas has the Candy Lady. No matter where you go, we are always running in fear of something, some story, and my town's no different. But instead of a story, we have a rule, and it's the one rule everyone follows. Never whistle in the graveyard. At an age old enough to understand, but young enough to believe it true, my dad sat me down in our living room and told me about the rule. At first, I laughed. My dad was known for being a lighthearted, jovial man, but my smile soon faded as the tone of his voice changed to one of unease. "I know it sounds make-believe," he said as his eyes welled up, "but there's a reason it's just you and I. I need you to promise me you'll follow this one rule. Please, for me, never whistle in the graveyard." His somber disposition filled me with dread as my eyes too started to feel a little stingy. But it wasn't sadness from the painful look on my dad's face. It was fear. My phone vibrated violently on my nightstand, jolting me awake. I rubbed the sleepy from my eye to get a better look at the time, and to see what asshole would be calling me at 3 a.m. I glanced over at Zach to see if the sound disturbed him, but as usual, he slept like the dead. Unknown caller. That's strange. I declined the call and rolled over. Once again, my phone began to vibrate with an intensity that caused anxiety to rise in my chest. I quickly rolled back over, picked up my phone, and hurried into the hall. "Hello?" Silence. "Who is this?" The line remained silent, then static slowly rose like a herd of elephants running from a lion. I promptly ended the call and started to make my way back to the bedroom when my phone began to shake in my hand. Unknown caller again. I turned around and quickly answered. "Whoever this is, you got the wrong number," I whisper-yelled into the phone, conscious of remaining quiet for Zach. "Is this Rebecca?" The soothing voice of an older-sounding gentleman crawled across the line, filling my mind with a mixture of unease and relief. "It's Becca. May I ask who I'm speaking with?" I said in annoyance at the lack of respect for time. "My name is Officer Carlisle. I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, but we need you to come home right away to identify a body." His words didn't sound real. There must be some mistake. He remained silent as I processed what he had just said. I felt dizzy as I could only picture one person I would ever have to identify. "Well, whose body?" I asked, barely above a whisper. And then he said it. The words I had feared since I moved out of that rickety old house in that rickety old town. "I'm sorry, Rebecca, but we think it's your dad." I moved at lightning speed as I packed my bag to prepare for the 2-hour drive back to my hometown. I finished up, grabbing a photo off my dresser of my dad as I closed the bedroom door. Zach was already waiting in the car, and we took off, still in our pajamas. After 2 hours, we had made it to the town I hadn't visited since my grandmother had passed away 5 years earlier. An eerie feeling I hadn't felt in years covered me, and I shivered, not knowing what the early morning would have in store. Carlisle instructed us to go to the coroner's office at the corner of 5th and Main. We made our way through the little town that looked familiar yet felt so different. As we pulled in, we were met by 2 policemen, one being Officer Carlisle. He opened my car door for me and asked me to follow him, Zach closely behind. We made our way down a flight of steps into a brightly lit, silver-plated room. A misshapen silhouette of a body lied underneath a crimson-red spotted white sheet on a long silver table in the middle of the room. A familiar face walked in as I recognized the man that assisted with my grandmother after she had passed. His eyes were filled with sadness as he made his way around the silver table, standing parallel to Officer Carlisle, Zach, and myself. We found the body lying halfway out of the cemetery. Please understand that this is going to be very hard to see, but we need to know if you can identify anything on the body that would be reminiscent of your dad. We haven't been able to get in contact with him. My eyes started to burn, and my heart raced as I took a step closer to the table. Zach stepped back out of respect. but I wanted nothing more than for him to put his hand over my eyes like he does when we watch a scary movie. The coroner slowly removed the blood-soaked sheet. My head began to spin, and I felt my knees buckle as I locked eyes with what used to be a person, mangled, unrecognizable, lifeless. It looked as if it were placed into a meat grinder, and the only part that wasn't absolutely destroyed was the left arm. I slowly made my way around to the opposite side of the table, and that's when I saw it. Covered in dried blood, a beaded bracelet I had made for my dad when I was a little girl. He never took it off. My vision went dark as I collapsed beside the table, almost landing in the meat lump remains of my dad. Zach and Officer Carlisle escorted me out of the room, knowing I recognized who it was. Zach came out of a small common area with a paper cup filled with water as I sat in a chair. Officer Carlisle brought out from a back room. My mind was racing as tears streamed down my face. How did this happen? Who would have done this to my dad? He was liked in this town. He had no enemies that I knew of. After 20 minutes, I was finally ready to talk. Who would have done that to my dad? I asked to Officer Carlisle, who stood in front of me with sorrow in his eyes. We are unsure at this moment, but... His words trailed off as he looked away uncomfortably out the window at the nearby graveyard roped off with yellow caution tape. I stared, wide-eyed at the officer who seemed to have more information than what he was giving me. Officer. I choked on my words as my dad's smile made its way across my memory. That's my dad. Please. He finally looked back at me, fear radiating off of him. We think he might have whistled in the graveyard. Sadness turned to fear, that turned to anger as my blood pressure rose like a thermometer. You've got to be fucking kidding me, I hissed through clenched teeth. That's a story told to scare little kids into not going out past curfew. My dad was murdered and you think it was a ghost story? Do we even actually know it's true? My adrenaline kicked in as I quickly stood up and made my way towards the door, pushing past Carlisle, who tried to grab my arm. I ripped my arm away and rushed out into the cool morning air. I directed Zach as we made our way out of the parking lot and towards my childhood home, passing the graveyard my dad died in hours earlier. I stared in awe at the yellow caution tape lining its perimeter when something finally broke my trance. It looked like a young man in a retro-dated outfit standing behind one of the taller headstones towards the back of the plot. As we made our way past, I turned around in my seat, and he was gone. Zach questioned what I was looking at, but I didn't feel like explaining. We pulled into my dad's driveway, his truck parked in the same spot he always parked in. Zach grabbed our bags, while I got the spare key out from under the rug on the front porch to let ourselves in. Happy feelings came rushing back as my mind played memories of my dad and I like a movie reel. They were quickly followed by sadness as I came back to reality of the events that had just transpired. We made our way into the living room, and I plopped down on the couch that looked like it came right out of the 70s. Which it did. Zach sat across from me in my dad's recliner, careful not to disturb anything. After about 15 minutes, he finally spoke. Beck, can I ask you something? I finally looked up, not having realized I had been staring at a water ring stain on the coffee table that entire time. Why was Carlisle concerned about your dad whistling in the cemetery? I blinked hard at the question, and suddenly Zach was gone and replaced by a young version of my dad. I felt my heart beat harder as the room transformed around me into the home of my youth. Clean, bright. It felt like someone finally pressed play on the remote as my dad began to explain the one rule our town had. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the couch in anticipation of the words I tried so hard to forget. Becca, I need you to listen to me. It's very important, okay? There's a rule in our town that everyone has to follow. You can never, ever, under any circumstance, whistle in the graveyard. I know it sounds make-believe, but there's a reason it's just you and I. The graveyard makes you see things. Versions of people you might not get to see much anymore. Right after you were born, your mommy lost her daddy. And the graveyard told her if she whistled for him, he would come back to get her so they could be together. My heart ached as my dad relived the story of how my mom died. The mom I never got to meet and always dreamed of having. The pain in his eyes made sense that I didn't quite understand as a child. I need you to promise me you'll follow this one rule. Please, for me, never whistle in the graveyard. I was pulled back into reality where Zach sat staring at me from across the coffee table, waiting for a response. I want to share with him the rule, but I know in my heart, it isn't true. At least that's what I keep telling myself. The days passed in a haze as I made phone call after phone call to start setting up funeral arrangements for my dad. As it grew closer to the evening, I received a call that I was needed at the coroner's to fill out some paperwork. I told Zach I'd be fine by myself and made my way out to the car to head back across town. As I pulled into the parking lot and stepped out of my car, my eyes were drawn to movement in the cemetery across the street. There I saw the man we had passed just days earlier, still standing behind one of the larger headstones towards the back of the lot. He felt like a familiar presence masked with an unfamiliar stare as he watched me. I was suddenly filled with an unstoppable urge to go to him. I made my way across the street towards the entrance of the graveyard, ducking under the yellow caution tape. Who was this familiar stranger? I stepped carefully past graves as I made my way towards the back of the plot. The stranger's gaze still locked on me. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a man, but a short-haired woman dressed in 70s-era clothing with a pixie cut that swept slightly to the right of her face. She was beautiful. She smiled as I got closer. The warmth of the love she carried engulfed me as if I were caught in a rainstorm on a hot summer afternoon. She felt like home. "I've waited years to see you, Becca," the familiar woman said in a tone that soothed my soul, the heartache, and all the pain I'd felt over the last few days. Was this a dream? Am I still in bed in my home next to Zach? She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then she finally spoke. "I know you miss your dad, kiddo. I missed him too, but we can get him to come over here and the three of us can be the family you've always dreamt of having." My mom. I wanted to reach out and hug her and never let go. My heart was overjoyed at the thought of having both of them back. I couldn't let this opportunity pass. "How do we get him to come here?" I said with the eagerness a child would have after being presented with a new puppy. She smiled softly, filling everything around me with love and light. "All you have to do is close your eyes and whistle for him, and he'll come." I closed my eyes, giddy with the thought of seeing both my mom and dad together. I pursed my lips to make the loudest whistle I possibly could when another whistle suddenly came from behind me. I quickly opened my eyes to see my mom's beautiful smiling face contorted into an unfamiliar snarl as she stared past me. As I turned around to see who ruined this amazing moment, a gust of ice-cold air breezed up my backside and over my head, and I watched a cloud of black engulf Officer Carlyle. He screamed in agony as his bones cracked and his skin ripped while the black cloud ran laps around his body. I was suddenly pulled from the murderous scene as a large figure took over my line of vision. It ushered me to the entrance of the graveyard, its hands pressed firmly over my ears so I wouldn't hear the horrible sounds emanating from behind me. As I stepped out of the graveyard, the terrible sounds behind me stopped. It felt like the world had stopped. I turned around to see what had happened to Officer Carlyle, but he was gone. The woman was gone. The figure that saved my life was gone. In a daze, I made it back to my car. I crawled into the driver's seat and laid my head on the steering wheel, trying to regroup before I went inside. Unexpectedly, 3 knocks on my window jolted me upright. The coroner gave a light-hearted smile as he signaled for me to roll down my window. He handed me a large envelope and, as if he knew what had happened, told me to fill out the paperwork inside whenever I was ready. I drove back to my dad's house and plopped back down on the old couch, envelope still in hand. Zach was in the shower, so I figured I'd go ahead and take a look at what needed to be signed. I flipped the envelope upside down to release the paperwork inside onto the coffee table. Only two things fell out. The first thing was the bracelet I had made for my dad when I was a little girl, now cleaned and restored back to its original color. The second was a folded-up piece of paper. Hands shaking, I unfolded the note. Promise me you'll never try to whistle in the graveyard again. I love you, Becca. Love, Dad.